Recently, a client reached out. They wanted a custom artwork that showed a particular moment where her partner and her daughter were enjoying the grassy field in Inwood Hill Park, which is up here in uptown Manhattan. She had a very particular idea. She had a photo that we could reference, and here she is happy with the final artwork. In this video, I'm going to show what it takes to start with a client's idea, to set expectations so that everyone's on the same page, and to achieve a final artwork that everyone's happy with. So my client found me on the internet. They reached out and we started a conversation. She sent me a photo that basically showed her partner and her daughter in this field. And it's a great picture already. And she had a specific request to start off with, which is she wanted to show some more of the bridge in the background. That's the Henry Hudson Bridge. And she wanted to basically remove a bunch of the trees and foliage that were blocking the view. And so that was something I agreed to from the start. Not a big deal at all. The great thing about having someone who approaches me with a photograph is that I know that they already have a strong idea of what they want. Also, it's great for me to already have some shapes and composition and colors and mood and atmosphere. The challenge, though, is that just because a client has a picture, it doesn't mean that it's going to be what it will look like in the end. And there's always potential changes and ideas that the client might have, or that I might have, which can help to basically get us to a final image that we can agree on. And basically what I did was I took that photograph and I began with a rough sketch to show what the final composition would look like. After sending my client that first sketch, she actually came back with some more thoughts. And this is great because it is an iterative process and you have to be ready for that. The client came back and suggested that perhaps there's too much field in the foreground, and could we somehow zoom in so that there's a lot less empty space in the front. So in my response to my client's feedback, I basically took that photo and I cropped it to come up with 3 different options. Basically, one was a tighter crop of the entire image, moving the image to the left or the right. And so out of these 3 options, we actually ended up on this last one. And this is what eventually became the final composition. Overall, I think it ended up being a really great choice. The starting point for this entire painting, after finishing the sketch based on that last option we picked, was to create a wash and basically lay down a wash for the background as much as possible. Obviously starting with the sky, and you see the blues that I'm putting in, and that's basically a Prussian blue, and I'm wetting the whole paper from basically the edge of the field going up towards the top, the background containing the sky. And I'm using a paper towel basically to create some streaks in the sky. So it's not just a flat wash of blue, but there could be some streaks, some cloudy streaks in the sky that are not super well defined, but there's just an impression of clouds. I also wet the bottom half of the painting to start putting in some of the yellows and greens for the grassy field. And I was careful to outline the figures so I'm not getting the figures completely wet. It's okay if the water spills into the figures in the scene, but I wanted to lay down the water in such a way that if there's color that I'm putting into the wash, that it will kind of naturally stay away from the insides of the figures. I used Hansa Yellow Medium to start putting in a light yellow underlayer for all of the greenery. And this is sort of what I usually do when I'm doing grass or trees. There's always some lighter, more yellowish highlights that I want to have already in the scene so that I can put green, darker green over that later. Really, the most important part of this scene is my client's partner and their daughter. So everything I'm doing in support of ultimately making those two figures be the central focal point. And so as I'm painting, I'm avoiding covering up their bodies, and I'm doing as much as I can to basically use the negative space around them to show the contours of those figures. You can see that I'm putting the green down, and the green basically helps us to, again, block in the shapes of my client's partner and their daughter. And I'm avoiding going inside the lines of their figures. This is a sap green that I'm using on top of the yellow. The sap green is my go-to color for doing grass. And then later on, you're going to see me use some darker shades of green that are cooler, and those will help provide some depth and contour to the grass. While I'm waiting for the green to dry, I start approaching some of the buildings and the structures in the background, and I can use some yellow ochre to put down a light layer over the buildings that we see. And I'm trying to be pretty faint and light-handed with anything that's in the background, including the bridge. And that's because, again, I want the field and the two figures in the field to really be the focal point. Here I'm going over the top edges of the trees, and that's really helping to bring out some depth and volume to the trees. The yellow underlayer helps us to maintain some of the highlights that will peek through the green layer on top. There's also trees that are underneath the bridge, behind the bridge in the distance. And so there are a lot of places where I'm going to be filling in the colors of vegetation and foliage to help basically define the shape. I'm using the negative space around the bridge to define the shape of the bridge. As I get close to the figures again, I'm careful to stay outside of the outlines of the figures, and anything that I do outside of their shapes will help to further define it. Again, it's like using negative space to show the shape of the two people in the image. Whenever I put down paint in one part of a painting, we have to let it dry, so that gives me a chance to actually move around, and you'll see me jumping from spot to spot, and that's partly to just let a certain area dry and resolve. And I'll go to another section and start to use the same paint that's on my brush and basically try to cover some other areas. I'm using some more sap green, but a darker shade of it, where I've added some perylene green, and that's helping to create some darker passages like shadows towards the base of the greens. This stage is always fun because adding the darker colors helps us to really bring out the volume and the depth in the painting, and it really starts to help make certain things pop and feel more substantial. That's always a fun part for me as an artist. As you're painting bushes and trees and grass, other foliage, having a range of values of the greens and the yellow highlights helps to create a sense of volume, helps to create a sense of shape. And there's light that hits the top of the grass, top of the trees. Those areas are going to be brighter, and as you go further down towards the base of a particular element, you're going to have midtones and darks and shadows. So it's a good thing to practice, basically, to have different shades of a certain color so that you can kind of recreate that sense of something being exposed to the light and areas closer to the ground being less exposed. Because the bridge is an important piece of this painting, but because it's in the background, I want to treat it appropriately. And basically, I've lightly managed areas around the bridge. I'm going to get to that eventually, but I'm trying not to be too careful about the bridge and its elements because it really is in the background. Painting the areas around the figures, like I mentioned before, it's like painting negative space, and we're painting the darks and the structures in the distance and the grass and some of the other trees and things like that around the outside of the figures to help us show the inside of the figures. So it's a fun way to bring out the figures. We're going to be filling them in later, as you'll see. You'll see as I'm dabbing away at the various elements, especially in the background, I'm not trying to be super accurate to the photo, but I am trying to follow some of the curves and the large shapes that I see. Oftentimes I'll squint at a scene, squint at the photo, and basically try to understand where the contours are, where are the largest shapes, where are the passages of like trees that are lined up next to each other, or where do things kind of fall off and something else begins? Where are they cut off? And those things are the things, especially for subject matter that's in the background. Those are the important things to get across, not necessarily the minutia, the minute details that we think are there, but really it's to just give the impression that there are rows of trees, or that there are certain places that are in front of structures or are are being blocked by structures. Again, I keep going back to my Paraline green, which is a cooler shade of green, to get at some of the darker areas in the scene. And Paraline green does have some blue to it, which helps to make things naturally feel like they're further away or that they're darker. So that's always useful as you approach things in the background. In a lot of my paintings, I will start off with the brighter yellow and then brighter greens and get richer and richer with the greens. And then eventually I'll get to the Paraline green, my go-to for shadows on green objects, basically. And I'll lay that on top of what I've already put down. And that sequence is a very typical sequence for me where I'm painting from light to dark, essentially. But sometimes when there's a particular subject matter that's a color that we all know, like grass is green. Well, grass, if you actually look at a blade of grass, there's going to be many different values in that blade. There's going to be the lighter yellows that are going to be the highlights. There's going to be the green, which for me is a sap green. And then from there, you have some midtones, and then you get to the darker areas, particularly areas that are in shadow or towards the closer to the ground. So Perylene green works really well for me for that purpose. Here I start on the figure's clothing, and I start with a wet on wet technique. Basically, I'm filling in the figure's clothing with a layer of water, and then I'm putting in some grays that will be like the clothes that are on the figures in the picture. I'm using wet on wet because there are so many soft edged portions of the clothing where there's like folds and the light is hitting it. And if you make it too sharp, then it feels a little unnatural. So more realistic here for me is to actually use a wet on wet technique, and that helps to get across some of the undulating and uh, folds that there's gradients basically in the clothing. There's also sharp edged contrasting dark areas in the clothes, and that is part of the scene in this photograph, but I'm going to get to that towards the end. Painting the figures takes a little bit longer because I want to intentionally use some layers to basically cover certain portions, and you have to give some time for those layers to dry. If I keep applying paint into a wet area, I'll either start making it lighter because you're intentionally basically lifting off color, or I could just disturb it and cause unwanted blooms with the water from the brush. So oftentimes you have to wait for these layers to dry before you start trying to deepen it, make it more saturated by putting on more of the color or adding other brush strokes. Luckily for me, the clothing of the characters here in the scene were pretty simple. They were not very complex. Basically, not a lot of color in the clothes, so that made it relatively easy for me to paint. It's also helpful for me if the faces are not showing, and it actually lends, having the backs to us lends a more impressionistic, memorable, moody feel to this image, which I also enjoy. Here you can see I'm painting dark areas in the bridge, and again, I'm intentionally being very light with it and not too heavy-handed. I don't want the bridge to stand out. I don't want it to overwhelm the scene. It could easily overwhelm the scene because if you just look really carefully and zoom in at the bridge, there's all these different structures and lines and angles, and I only really want to convey the bridge by painting in some of the key dark areas that really help show the shape and structure and all the complexities of the bridge. So I'm trying to show the complexities of the bridge without really painting too much of the bridge. If I paint too much of the bridge, your eyes as a viewer are going to be drawn to that, and that will take away from the focus of my client's partner and their daughter. Again, I always enjoy this part because adding these dark elements, especially to the structures, they really help to bring the scene to life, and they make these structures appear more realistic. And again, you don't have to be very, very specific with all of the shapes in that bridge, but identifying certain key parts of that bridge will help to get across what it is, and people will automatically, subconsciously understand what is there way in the distance. So I'm approaching the end here. I'm putting finishing touches on the characters. This is the really fun part. It's also a little bit scary. It can be a little intimidating because I've done all this work on the rest of the painting, and now I'm really going to be focusing on getting my client's partner and their daughter correct as much as possible. So for any commission, I definitely put a lot of emphasis on getting proportions and faces and bodies correct. Those are the things that are we really can't compromise on. In other parts of the painting, we can be a little bit looser, we can be a little bit more impressionistic, but with the if there are subjects, if there are figures in the scene, especially important figures, it's crucial to get the accuracy. I don't hold myself out to be a portrait painter per se, but I have had experience painting portraits, and it's something I'm relatively comfortable with. But there are so many other artists who do a much, much better job of painting portraits than I do. So I humbly refer those kinds of requests to other artists. The skin tones of the characters in the scene are achieved by using yellow ochre, some uh, burnt umber, very, very light shades. Again, we have to think about the values in the scene. There's a bright sun in the scene, and that means there are dark shadows in the areas not exposed to the sun. So it's a combination of very light skin tones on the surfaces that are facing the light, and then beneath, I used darker shades of the browns that I was using. And I'm very close to the end because I'm fine tuning some of the dark areas. So after the areas on the figures have dried, I can go in with pretty saturated versions of the colors I've been using, including a bit of blue in those mixtures so that I can basically show a really dark area, like showing the curvature of the hair towards the bottom that's away from the light, or the area in the adult's armpit on the left, and then the area under their uh, uh, on the bottom side of their pants. Also, where there are some pretty high contrast dark areas, small areas, but they're higher contrast, like the folds of the shirt and where the bottom of the shirt lays on top of the waist. I'm also taking the opportunity to go back with a drier brush of greens to basically put on some areas in the grass, some shadowy areas, some rough looking areas, and this will help give some texture to the grass so it's not just a flat wash of green. And there's also some shadowy areas uh, to the left of the figure's feet. And I've painted the shadows around their feet by just painting not just a straight line for shadow, but actually just carefully putting in some darks around some particular blades of grass that helps to get across the fact that there's no light hitting those blades of grass. These are really the finishing touches. I'm adding some scrapes of green throughout, and these basically just help to give the field some texture, and just the field isn't completely flat and the grass isn't all even everywhere. So there's little hills and bumps and the ground goes up and down. So these passages of texture of slightly darker green will help to convey the rolling nature of the field. And I'm putting the final touches on the tops of the figures, the shadowy areas on the face and the back of the heads. These will really help to pin down the shapes of the figures' heads. If you enjoyed this video, check out this other custom artwork where I painted the portraits, including the pets, of my clients. Like, share, and subscribe to see more of my artwork, or you can also check out my website, art-francis.com, where you can see more information about my original artworks, as well as how to commission me for a custom artwork. Until the next time, go and paint.